Hello, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, I'm the RJB0, and welcome to the third installment of my Taking Down the Top Tier series about the anti-meta and you. This week I've spent most of the week trying to cut this video down below 10 minutes, and let's see how I do. Alright, so today I'm going to be talking about a pair of patterns that I think are actually really helpful to the game, and to somebody who's trying to develop an anti-meta deck or predict how they're going to play against the meta in the future, because they help us to see how the meta and the anti-meta develop within a format. And the interesting thing about these patterns, and it's something I'm going to be following throughout the video, is that they actually very accurately predict or explain why Dino went from being the deck that defined the meta last format to being basically the perfect anti-meta deck for this format. So let's get down to it. Okay, so first, some prerequisite knowledge about the first pattern. In my opinion, there are really only three types of deck that really define the meta, and those are stun, control, and aggro. Of course, there are other types of decks. You've got your stall decks and your Exodia decks and whatever, but until, God forbid, there's a final countdown format, I'm not really going to consider those when talking about how the meta is developed, because I don't really think they're relevant to the meta. I think you might have to side a couple of cards against them every once in a while, but that's just about it. They have no bearing on how the meta works. So the other thing is, of course, there are decks, or most decks, follow at least two of those categories. One kind of as the dominant strategy, and one kind of as a second strategy, but that actually really plays into how this works. So the pattern that I have noticed in the meta and the anti-meta, just in general, is that the three types of decks that I mentioned previously work a lot like rock, paper, scissors. So in order to really explain that pattern, you first have to know my definitions of each of these deck types. First, you've got your control decks. Control decks are based around, gaining control of the game state. Deciding when cards exit and enter the field, and controlling what kinds of things each player can do when. It doesn't require a lot of commitment to the field. That is one of the hallmarks of a control deck, and they also use a lot of back row. Then there are stun decks. Stun decks are a little bit like control, but are also a little bit different. A stun deck strategy is to try and keep your opponent from gaining a foothold in the game, either by keeping them from gaining field presence, taking away their primary strategies with cards like Skill Drain and Necro Valley, or by taking away cards from their hand, by depleting their resources. Those are all very stun strategies. And then there's aggro. Aggro is probably the most straightforward of all the deck types, and it's really based around getting big field presence on the board and keeping that field presence while gaining advantage over your opponent through battle. So the rock, paper, scissors kind of thing works like this. Stun beats control because control relies on having control over the field, and if stun keeps your opponent's field clear or takes away your opponent's strategies, then they can't do that. Generally, control beats aggro because control says, yeah, sure, build up your big field presence, but I'm going to decide what you do with that. And you see that with in the format that seemed to be kind of Gravekeepers versus Plants, where Gravekeepers often beat Plants because Plants would just establish this big, or attempt to establish this big field, and Gravekeepers would keep them from actually using it properly. And then you have aggro beats stun because stun is all based around keeping your opponent from getting a foothold, and it's really easy for an aggro deck to gain a foothold in the game. It's really easy for an aggro deck to put cards on the board. Examples of each of these deck types, this is kind of important just to give the clear picture. For control, of course, I said Gravekeepers. Inzectors are a control-based deck, strangely enough. Mermails are primarily control, and you have Windups are also a very control-based deck. Stun decks are a little bit like cat ions in that they often say stun in their name. So you've got TG stun, Malefic stun, Rock stun, Gadget stun. But then you have Dino Rabbit. Dino Rabbit is also a very stun deck. And then you have aggro, which are things like Chaos Dragon. Chaos Dragon is a fantastic example of an aggro deck. So I said that Dino Rabbit works really well into these patterns and the previous workings of Dino Rabbit, and I'm going to explain why now. So if you look at the last format, the way that Dino Rabbit's dynamic life kind of played out, this really holds true. Let's look first at the very beginnings of Dino Rabbit. When it was in the winter of last year, when it really had two main competitors in the meta. There were three main decks, which were Windups and Zectors and Rabbit kind of sat above those as a tier 0 or a tier 0.5 deck. And why is that? Well, it's because Rabbit is a stun deck, and as I mentioned earlier, in Zectors and Windups were both very control decks. Of course, Windups were more of a stun type deck in game 1 because their job was to get rid of your hand and take away your resources. But games 2 and 3, they were a very control-based deck at the time, and they still are to this day. So Rabbit sat way above those two decks because it's a stun deck, which does really well against control decks. But now let's examine the decks that ended up beating Dino Rabbit, that kept it from winning a YCS in the United States for ages. Well, first there was TG Stun. Now TG Stun is a stun deck itself, but also relies on a very strong aggro style, using Barbaros and Horn of the Phantom Beast to get large field presence on the board while using Skill Drain as a stun card. So that took down Rabbit pretty easily. And then at YCS Long Beach, it's interesting that you got Heroes and Dark Worlds rising above the rest. And Heroes is itself kind of a stun deck, but it also has a lot of 1900 beaters. It's easy for a hero deck to get big cards on the board. But also they had their ace up their sleeve in the form of Super Poly. But the Dark World deck that ended up winning, it's no accident that build was what won and what went on to make Dark Worlds gain their place in history as the most horrifying game 1 ever, which was that deck that won YCS Long Beach was very fast in getting Graphas on the board. It just spammed Grapha and hand control cards, so it got the stun aspect off faster than the Dino Rabbit deck could, but then overpowered it with a secondary aggro strategy. And that's what really beat the Dino Rabbit deck. Then you get, later in the format, you have Chaos Dragon, which is like the aggro deck. And Chaos Dragon just totally wiped Dino Rabbit off the board. So then you get into this format. In this format, you actually have a strong control base. You have decks like your Gaia, Mermail, Windups, Inzectors. All of these decks are very control-based. And Rabbit, being the stun deck that it is, has a massive advantage over those decks. But even more so, since half of this meta is still an aggro deck, it follows the second pattern that I am going to talk about, which is that when macro is in favor, Effect Veiler goes out of favor. Well, there's a couple reasons for that, the first being the obvious one, that you can't use Effect Veiler while macro is on the board, but also it's because when macro is in the game, when macro is big in the meta, or a lot of decks are hurt by macro, it's because most of their work happens in the graveyard, and Effect Veiler doesn't have any jurisdiction over the graveyard. So macro over Effect Veiler or Effect Veiler over macro is one of the most important patterns in the meta, and it's what's making Dino Rabbit so good as an anti-meta deck right now, because not only can it main macro, which takes out all the aggro decks that it would have trouble with normally, but Effect Veiler is out of favor right now because so many decks are hurt more by macro than they are by Veiler. So Valor isn't even a very big deal, and Valor hurts the Dino Rabbit deck. So that's why Dino Rabbit is doing really well right now. I am just over 10 minutes right now, so I'm going to let you guys discuss this in the comments, and that is my take on the current top tier and how to get rid of it. This is the RJB0 signing out. Once I can restart my computer here. There we go. See ya.